Welcome to our last weekly review in Ketubot. I thought Ketubot would never end, but when you do Daf Yomi, this space, everything ends at one point. That's the beauty of it. We will eventually get through it. So welcome to your lightning 30-minute review of what we studied this week. We're joined this week. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is My Jewish Learning. This is somewhere at the very end of Ketubot, and we are joined this morning by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. So let's get started.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here to study Talmud. For me, early in the morning, but for you guys, whatever time zone you're in. This week, we, amongst other topics, we had a run of pages that talked about the final days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who in rabbinic tradition is known for being the editor of the Mishnah, or the person in charge of the project by which lots of people edited the Mishnah and brought it together. In the rabbinic mind, a huge figure in his day and a leader in his generation. And it struck me this time reading these stories in Masechet Ketubot, I couldn't help but juxtapose it with all the images I have from the television of watching England sit Shiva, so to speak, for the Queen, and to think about what it means to lose a central figure who's not just central to political life, or not just central to cultural life, but somehow central to your identity. Watching from afar the country of England mourn was fascinating to me, and just thinking about the impact of one person whose steady presence over a lifetime touched the lives of so many was in my mind as I looked at the text about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. It's hard to know how central Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in the lives of all Jews in his day, because it's hard, since the rabbinic record is mostly the historical record we have of the period, aside from some Roman texts and some other historical texts and some archaeology. It's hard to know how prominent the rabbis were in the society in which they lived. And if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was an important figure just for the circle of rabbis who are mentioned in the Mishnah, or was a prominent figure for all of Israel, from the center of the Sanhedrin to the far-reaching suburbs and farmlands throughout Israel. But certainly in the rabbinic record, he is the Nasi, right? He, attached to his name is his title, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda, the president of the Sanhedrin. Other people after him became Nasi, but that name, that title was affixed to his name, and he's always referred to it in the Talmud. And today we're going to take a peek at some of the stories that the Talmud reports leading up to his death. And if you've been following in the daily emails, you'll notice that these stories touch on the ones that were featured in the emails this week, but they're different slices of the story. So if you want to get the full run of stories in these 2 pages, you should go back and go online. If you haven't seen the emails, look for pages 103 and 104. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Before I do that, though, I know some people like to look on their own. So I just put into the text a link that'll let you view the slides or look at them later. But I'm going to share my screen so you can look at the text together. Here we go. And now I'm going to start the slideshow. All right. So the first text looks at Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who is ill and on his deathbed, starting to prepare for his, for his death, and he calls his sons and speaks to them. So at the time of the passing of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he said, "I need my sons," and his sons enter the room, and he says to them 3 things. Be careful with the honor of your mother. 2, my lamp should be lit in its usual place, and my table should be in its usual place, and my bed should be arranged in its usual place. And 3, Yosef, Ephani, and Shimon Ephrati, they served me during my lifetime, and they should serve me during in my death. What's interesting to me about this is not that he's calling in his sons and giving them 3 final wishes, and each of these seem to make sense. Like, be careful, be meticulous about honoring your mother. That's a nice thing for someone to set to charge their kids with. Keep my lamp, arrange the household the way it's been arranged, going into the future. And the people who served me during my lifetime, they should, serve me during my death. Like, when you read that the first time, it peaks at they have some role at the funeral, maybe the pallbearers. What's interesting to me here is that the Gemara, in talking about these stories, looks into each of these things and seems that they're not exactly as straightforward as a first read might give them. And there's always that question reading the Gemara, like, is that because they're not straightforward, or is that because that the Gemara applies its Gemara logic to stories like it does to legal texts? You could determine which you think is here, and it might not be the same for each of the 3. But I want to look at the 3 and see each of these 3 things and see what the Gemara does with it, and how the meaning might change as we go. So the first one, be careful with the honor of your mother. The Gemara asks, why would he need to say this? After all, this is written in the Torah, right? Honor your father and your mother. Right? It's one of the 10 utterances that appear on the tablets that Moses gave to the Israelites, from God at Revelation at Sinai. This is a big mitzvah. Honor your father and your mother. If that's true, why would it be that this is what Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi has to say to his sons? Shouldn't they know this one already? Because in fact, right, both his sons are rabbis in their own rights. You wouldn't think he would have to remind them of such a prominent biblical ethical mitzvah. And the Gemara answers, well, she was their father's wife, which means Rabbi Yehuda had a wife who had children, and she died, and he remarried. So his wife, who served as mother to these boys for a while, was the mother of the household, but not directly their mother. And so his request to them, be careful with the honor of your mother, is, in fact, well placed here, because she's not their biological mother. And we know from literature and drama television that sometimes a stepmother is not as embraced by, I guess from life experience as well, that sometimes the relationship between step parents and stepchildren is different. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wants to make sure that after he goes, that his children give the proper honor to his wife. So that's one of his final requests to them. The second one, my lamp should be lit in its usual place, and his chair set and his bed made. The Gemara asks, what's the reason he made these requests? And the Gemara explains, I love this part. It's a little fantasy in the Gemara. Maybe every Shabbat Eve, even after his passing, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would come to sit in his house as he had done during his lifetime. So why did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi want his chair to be set and his bed made and his lamp set up? Well, after he died, says the Gemara, his spirit still inhibited his household. And lest you think that this is meant sort of metaphorically, which is one way to read it, right? Rabbi Yehuda's presence was so strong that even after he died, the people who lived in his house could still feel his presence there, and they kept up some of the traditions of the household, so you could feel his presence there. There's a story that says maybe some of the household members took this more literally, and it goes as follows. It happened on a certain Shabbat Eve. A neighbor came and called and knocked on the door, and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's maidservant said to her, the guest, the neighbor, be quiet. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is sitting right now, right? Sitting in his chair by his lamp, maybe reading. And when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, his spirit at this point, heard his maidservant reveal his presence to the neighbor, he did not come again. Why? So as not to cast aspersions on earlier righteous individuals who didn't appear to their families following their death. So I find this to be quite an interesting story. I guess it's good, right? Halloween is coming too. This is a ghost story in the Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda's spirit, says the Talmud in this story, resided in his household, right? One of the great things about this great person, what did he deserve? Not just a life in leadership, but because of his contributions as Nasi, he earned, and editing the Mishnah, right? All the things that he did, he earned this moment. After his life, his spirit could still return and reside in his household, and his presence could be there, it seems actually, with his family. But once it became publicly known, his spirit was so concerned with how that would impact the community. Once the neighbor found out, he was like, oh, well, if people know that my spirit is in the house, that'll look bad for other righteous individuals who didn't merit having their spirit be able to return to visit their families after they died. And so then he stopped coming. So it was a short-term benefit for the family, I guess, that his spirit was actually there until later. So that's the second piece. Here's the third one. So the two servants who served him during his lifetime should serve him during his death. And this, as I hinted at before, the Talmud says, it was understood from this that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was speaking right about this world. These two servants should serve in his death and administer his burial, right? He had servants who took care of him for a long time, members of his household, who were his aides. He wanted them to be in charge of the funeral or to take care of the details or to be the pallbearers or something. But it turns out that they died before he died. And what that means, says the Gemara, since it must have been, seems that, if they died after he made this statement, it could be he died before he made the statement, just the Gemara is filling in because we didn't know, or it's possible that they died between this statement and his death. But since they died before him, the Gemara says we can learn from this that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's intention was, not only will these people be with me in this world, they will join me in the world to come and be my servants there as well. So these are three things that Rabbi Yehuda tells his children to prepare for his death. And what I find compelling about this narrative run is the way in which the Gemara digs into these details, like it digs into the details of legal and other passages, and says, you might understand it immediately one way, but actually there's more depth to this. There are different ways to do it, different ways to understand it. And after reading the Gemara, you have a different vision of this, of each of these items and what specifically they mean and what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's intention was. All right, I want to pause right here. I have another snippet of text to look at, but I see there are a couple. I'm going to stop sharing screens, bring back up my chat. Wondering if there are comments or questions or responses to these stories before we go on to one more.
Rob Plass is offering some alternative interpretations based on biblical texts that are kind of fun to read in the comments.
Got it.
So I just want to take
I'm going to check that. The bed should be arranged as usual place. Instructions not to repeat the moving of the bed incident from Genesis. The lamp should be lit in its usual place. Warning that not to bring alien fire. Ooh. Serve me a death. Maintain harmony among brothers as Isaac and Ishmael were reunited to bear Abraham. I like that biblical echoing. Nice job, Rob. This could be right. You've created a midrash from this story by connecting biblical verses to this. Save that. This is good, right? 7 years from now, we'll need the week in review. You should come on and Rachel, you should note this, right? Rob should come on and teach this midrash 7 years from now for the week in review. Any other thoughts or questions?
Question about the maidservant.
Yeah, MJ says he made no mention of his wonderful maidservant, right? He has this dedicated maidservant That's actually true, right? Part of the text that we're not looking at today is after his sons leave, he calls in the sages, and he has instructions for them as well. If you want to read about those, they're in the email, the daily review by email. Oh, Stephen, hang on. I see your comment. We're coming to that. Hang on. There's more about the maidservant coming. Stephen's read ahead. But MJ says, right, he doesn't mention anything about the maidservant, right? It's interesting, the maidservant as a character. She plays a role in all of these stories, and she's going to play a central role in the story that comes later. And what a literary element of Talmudic stories, which is an interesting one, is often the woman who appears in the story, right, a single, sometimes it's a named woman, sometimes it's a key person in the household, also ends up as the hero of the story, right? We know from Masechet Ketubot, part of the painful part of the last 100 pages or so is women's place in rabbinic society is not the same as is in our own. We've made progress in lots of ways, even though there are ways in which, despite the things that were uncomfortable sometimes to read in Masechet Ketubot, a lot of things the rabbis put into place were progressive in their day. But in the literary stories, female characters are often the voice of reason, often one up the rabbis, often become the hero of the stories, or the ones who really say or do the thing that we're supposed to focus on. And that's actually a good segue. I'm going to share my screen to the oh wait, I might be confused between what I wrote about and what's on the next slide. The next slide is going to surprise me as well. Hang on. Oh, you know what? MJ, you're right. I wrote about that one. We'll come back to that story at the end because I wrote about it.
I can put the piece up. I can put the piece in the chat, but just to refresh everybody's memory, it's the key Talmudic piece that's cited in discussions of euthanasia, right? Because Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is in his last days of life. That's clear. He's very ill. He's going to the bathroom constantly. We think that means he probably had some kind of intestinal disease, which is talked about a lot in rabbinic texts and elsewhere. It's a difficult way to go. And he and his pupils are devastated, and they are praying and praying to keep him in the world. And when his maidservant sees how much he is suffering, she takes a jug and tosses it off the roof of his home, and the crash startles the pupils. They stop praying, and that's the moment that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi departs the world. Right. And so this is a discussion. This is often seen. Rabbi Goldberg, I think you wrote the piece, right?
I did.
I remember
That's why it was in my head. I wrote the piece, and that's why I didn't put it in the slides. But when it came up in the chat, I was like, oh yeah, we're going to talk about that.
That's the same maidservant, and this often comes up in discussions of euthanasia, and often it's interpreted that the Jewish view here is that we can actively hasten death necessarily, but we can remove artificial impediments to death.
Yes.
In such circumstances, in a merciful way.
Yes. Thank you for that recap, and sorry for my own misremembering which.
Yeah. So I will go find the piece on that. But that's more or less what it says, and we can move on to some of the other things that we didn't have a chance to see in the emails, because we can cover everything.
Gotcha. So this story sits next to that story, although they're both introduced with the same piece that the Gemara relates. On the day of the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, a divine. Oh, wait. Sorry, I have two more things coming. Oh my God. Sorry, I have to relocate myself. The Gemara relates on the day of the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, a divine voice emerged and said, "Whoever was present at the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is destined for life in the world to come." We've seen in our read of Daf Yomi, and we'll see a few more, as we continue, and that every once in a while the rabbis report hearing a divine voice enter the world. Right, and the merit of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was so great that it not only did he merit the world to come, but if you attended his funeral, That was a sign that you too would earn a place in the world to come. But the Gemara reports there was a certain launderer who would come before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi every day. But on this particular day, he didn't come. But when he heard this could be the divine voice, or this could be the news that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had died. It's a little unclear in the text. It could be either way. But on this day, he didn't come to see him for whatever reason. He was busy. But when he heard the news that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was dead, or when he heard about the divine voice, he was distraught. And he went up to the roof of his house, and while there, he fell to the ground and died. A tragic story potentially. For him and his family, although for the Gemara, there's an end that maybe is some that softens the blow. A divine voice emerged and says, that launderer too is destined for life in the world to come. Something so powerful about people who serve Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? This connects to the story we just saw before. Not only, you're right, his two servants accompanied him to the world to come, but here too, right, a worker or someone in the community who came before him every day also found destiny to reunite with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and be together in the world to come. Right, what a story that at first seems like a tragedy for the rabbis. It ends right with not as a tragedy, because the launderer makes the same transition and sits with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the world to come, a vision of which is. That's a good ending for the launderer, despite his short time in this world. While I think more about that, right? The primary life, in my perspective, is this world, not the next world. The rabbis think a lot about, this world is the prelude to the next world. So the launderer being with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, even though he missed the funeral and didn't fit in, right, his lifetime of service earned him that place in the world to come. Okay, not the last slide, but the last little snippet. This connects to, this is the one that's adjacent to the story that Rachel shared with us from the next page, Ketubot 104. Both this story and the story about the maidservant are introduced by this, that was related on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. The sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. Rachel alluded to this part, and they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died will be stabbed with the sword. So we heard about that summary about, right, they decreed a fast and prayed, and that kept him alive. But then there's this other piece about the rabbis did not want people to say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died, and they threatened, if you even mention that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died, the threat is you'll be stabbed with a sword, right? You'll be punished or maybe killed. And maybe that's a suggestion like, right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is still with us. Let's stay optimistic, right? Don't say like he's at his end, right? If you see him and observe him and you see how sick he is and how he's suffering, right? The rabbis forbid people to say like, oh, he's dying. This is it. This is the end. They don't want to come to terms with yet the death of their leader, their teacher, under threat of being put to the sword. But the sages, as they're praying and, hoping that his life will continue, send Bar Kapara, and they say to him, go and ascertain the condition of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. They send a messenger from amongst them to see, like, how is he doing? Let's get an update. Go to the nurses' station, I guess. There was no nurses' station then, but go see what his condition is. And Bar Kapara goes and found out that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died. And now he's stuck. He went to ascertain the condition of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but the rabbis had decreed that if you say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died, you could be, maimed by a sword or killed. But he has the news, which he has to share with them, but he's forbidden to do so under penalty of, harm. So what does he do? He tears his clothing, which is the traditional Jewish response to hearing about the death of a relative or a leader, but he reverses them so that the tear would be behind him, meaning he rips his shirt or his cloak, but then he puts it on backwards so the tear was in back. So if he walks into a room, no one will see it. right? So he does the morning ritual, but keeps it hidden. And he goes back to where the sages are and he begins to speak. Instead of sharing the news he learns, he says, the angels and the righteous mortals both clutched the sacred ark. The angels triumphed over the righteous, and the sacred ark was captured. This seems a little odd thing to say, and maybe there's a little code or puzzle into it. The rabbis unlock that because they say to him, has he died? Meaning, right, if the angels and the righteous mortals are both clutch the sacred ark, which is a stand-in for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the angels want him in heaven and the righteous mortals want him here on earth. And his statement says, right, the angels triumphed and the ark was captured. And that the rabbis who hear these references say he has died. And Bar Kapara says back to them, you said it, I didn't say it. Meaning, I came to deliver the news, but I just made this statement. I never said directly that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died, even though I conveyed that message to them. I delivered the news, but should not be subject to the decree that you put before me, before everyone, by saying, don't announce that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is dead. Bar Kabar here uses some cleverness to be able to break the difficult news to the students in a way that to his colleagues, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi students, those who are praying for him to stay in the world, does so in a way that both maybe softens the blow of the statement. He doesn't come in and say, right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has died. He has a softer way to say it, and keeps him out of trouble because actually he was forbidden to say it. And this is how they learn the news and switch from praying to preserve Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's life to mourning. And that is the end of this little snippet of the story today. So I'm going to come back to us here. Robert Starr asked the question of, that's like the question, why are these stories here? So I'm not, what's great about the chat is, it doesn't have the nuance or the intonation of how you ask that, and in good Gemara fashion, that question can mean lots of different things. Why are these stories here? One reason is, right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is a major figure of the rabbis of the Mishnah. And he, like a handful of other rabbis of the time of the Mishnah, because of their prominence, earn pages in the Talmud where stories are about their lives are told. Right, not every Mishnaic rabbi has so many stories told about him. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is one of them who does. Rabbi Akiva famously is another. There are a handful of others. Some have a few short stories, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has lots of stories. This was, a couple pages of Gemara just here about his death, and there are other stories about him in other places in the Talmud. So why are they here? He was important. The rabbis want to preserve their tradition about these stories. That's one answer. What you might be asking is, what puts these stories here on these pages in Masechet Ketubot? And that's a harder question to answer. In that, in context, they don't particularly relate to the theme of the parak. They don't particularly relate to recent Mishnayot. And there's a way that I remember my own, my own asking that question of the Gemara as I was reading through these pages. We're going along in our topics on Masechet Ketubot. There's sort of a pause, and the rabbis say, it just says the sages taught when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, was dying, here's what happened, and it goes on for a whole run of pages. So the stories are probably all connected to each other, and we know once the rabbis start on a tangent, they sometimes finish that whole tangent without concern for length. I
think I have a partial answer to Robert's question too.
Okay, please.
Rabbi Goldberg. This paragraph proceeds in, I put it in the chat. I've been looking back at the Gemara because I didn't have a ready answer to Robert's question either. Commercial break. They pause for commercial breaks, but this is a really interesting, sometimes figuring out what initiates a story, because there's usually something that triggers it, can tell you a lot about the story, not necessarily everything. So in sort of just looking at this quickly while we're meeting and talking, I don't have a full answer, but we have this teaching from Rav Huna. Not sure how we got here. I'd have to sit and think about it more, but he has this nice tripart teaching. He says the language of the sages teaches blessing, the language of the sages teaches wealth, and the language of the sages teaches healing. And then from there, the Gemara gives an example, a sort of easy example of how the language of the sages brings wealth, and another example of how it brings healing. And then we get the stories about Rabbi Yehuda.
Yeah.
So that, I suspect, is keyed to the last part of Rav Huna's teaching, that the language of the sages brings healing. That echoes for me the part of the story where the sages are praying to keep him alive. Though, of course, as is often the case, the story that follows can subvert. We know that the prayer of the students doesn't really bring healing. It brings a stay of death.
Yes.
For the length of their praying, but it actually is very much about the limits of what they can do. They can't heal him. And the maidservant knows that, and he knows that. And in some way, even they know that, right? That's why they say, don't tell us he's dead. We'll run you through with it. Like they
Right.
kind of seem to know that on some level. So the story in some way actually challenges that last teaching there of Rav Huna. So Robert, I don't know if that's a full or right answer, but I loved your question and I was thinking about it and going back to the Gemara. And so
Thanks
I
for going back. I appreciate that. Right. There are a couple of different hooks. That's one of the good ones. I have to say though, why the last way I read Robert's question was like, why are these stories here, like in this Zoom, meaning why did you, pick them?
I don't think it was a challenge to you.
No. I didn't mean that in a challenging. I didn't mean that in a challenging way. I meant like, of all the things we could have looked at this week, like why this, just in a curiosity sort of way. Maybe I didn't think Robert necessarily meant that. I didn't take it as a challenge, but Sylvia put in, my answer. Right. There's been a lot of Masechet Ketubot has a lot of law. It drills down in a lot of details. And for me, like for Sylvia, and I imagine for many of you, there's an enjoyment of the narrative portions I love Talmud. I love all the parts of Talmud. But if you've been reading since the beginning, Masechet Ketubot was not like Masechet Brachot. Masechet Brachot, the first Masechet, had a lot of law, but it had a lot of story. And Masechet Ketubot has law and stories that are more case law than stories. And for me, these pages were a refreshing change of pace after a long stretch of challenging legal prakim, and the way in which they were refreshing for me. I'd hope they would be refreshing for you as well in this space, and that's why I brought them here. So thanks. And Rachel, back
Great.
to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg. Thank you to the Talmud for a little narrative interlude, which is usually enjoyed and usually insightful too, on the including on the legal material. It usually really challenges and deepens our understanding of the legal material. The way they work together is usually very interesting to contemplate. So thank you for your good questions and your comments, and we will see you in your inbox tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.